I do not want to have the next generation of American Jews kind of be these snowflakes who are these, fragile and so delicate that they can't even imagine, coming across a professor who might challenge their entire, belief in Zionism or something like that. So I just think that we have to distinguish between what kinds of speech and what we expect of these administrations versus, go write all the op-eds you want.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I was still schmoozing, and we were ready to start. I'm Lily Rabinoff-Goldman, if I didn't come and meet you individually. I am the president and CEO at JCC Greater Boston. We're so happy to have you here this evening to join us for our Jonathan Saman Hot Buttons Cool Conversations speaker series. We have a distinguished panel of top journalists to engage in a thoughtful, in-depth discussion on the impact of Donald Trump's policies on the Jewish community. The conversation will explore critical issues, including Israel, anti-Semitism, and core American Jewish values within the broader political landscape. The panel will examine how Trump's presidency has influenced, shaped, and complicated Jewish interests at time so far. We're only 90 days in. So now to introduce our panelists. Somebody in the audience said, how will I know who's who? So when I say your name, could you give a little wave so they know who's who? So I will start by welcoming Gabby Deutch, Senior National Correspondent at Jewish Insider, where she covers politics, foreign policy, and a diverse array of stories across the Jewish world. Previously, she worked at The Atlantic and at NewsGuard. We are also pleased to welcome Eli Lake. Eli is a columnist for the Free Press and the host of Breaking History, which is a podcast. He has previously reported for Bloomberg News, The Daily Beast, and Newsweek. We are also joined by Jonathan Weisman, political reporter and editor for the New York Times. He is also the editor of Semitism, with Being Jewish in America in the Age of Trump. Moderating our panel tonight is Jane Eisner. Jane was the editor-in-chief at The Forward for more than a decade, the first woman to hold the position. She is also the former director of academic affairs at the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia. So I think that's it, and I will turn things over to Jane Eisner. Jane?
Thank you so much, Lily, for more than the mic. Thank you for assembling such a large group. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here for another timely discussion. I just want to personally give a shout out to Amy Eisner for assembling tonight's program, doing so much work. We are not, in fact, related. But maybe we should be, I don't know. Okay, well, we're going to delve right in. So Jonathan, you get the first question. You were on the campaign trail for quite some time for the New York Times, and now you're editing national stories. When you were out on the trail, I am really curious to know, what did you hear from then candidate Trump about issues of special concern to Jews? About Israel policy or anti-Semitism? How often did these topics come up? And also curious, what was the reception in the crowd when he talked about these things?
I mean, Trump tended to bring up Judaism with Jews, or Israel with Jews. He didn't, on his stump speech, and believe me, I heard his stump speech many times, it's hours long. I mean, and look, he could go on for 2 hours and not mention Jews or Israel. If he was in Erie, Pennsylvania, you weren't going to hear about Jews. But when he was, remember, right before the election, he was before a Jewish group, and he said, if I lose, it's because of you. So, he had this interesting mix of honey and barbs, and he would tell Jews that he would be their best friend or their worst enemy, depending on how they behaved, how we behaved. And it's a jarring thing to listen to a presidential candidate say, if I lose, it will be because of you. That was I hit that statement made me write an entire story about that because there was a sense that he was, at the time we didn't know who was going to win, and it felt like he was setting up a scapegoat in the Jewish community, or maybe he was going to threaten. And the fact of the matter is, Jews didn't really change their vote very much. Kamala Harris got her 71%, which was maybe slightly on the lower end of the very short range of the Jewish vote. It didn't really change much, but there is a more vocal pro-Trump Jewish community out there, and Trump did a very good job of dividing them. I will say that the Republican convention featured Jews very, very prominently. That was quite something.
I want to get back to this whole question about the vote, but just to ask you a follow-up on this, I'm curious whether Israel policy came up in any other venues other than Jewish ones.
Trump was very selective on that. I mean, remember, he wooed the Arab and the Muslim vote in the Arab American and Muslim American vote in Michigan with all sorts of entreaties to them, and his idea was, I am going to bring peace to the Middle East. He didn't necessarily tell them how he was going to bring peace to the Middle East, but he at least paid attention to the notion that Muslims were dying, that Arabs were dying in Gaza, and to the Arab American voters in Michigan, that was very alluring. He won Dearborn, Michigan. So I think Trump is is a very talented politician, and he could be all things to all people depending on his audience.
So, Gabby, I want to follow up on what Jonathan talked about, because you work in Jewish media now. And in 2024, as was mentioned, just as in previous presidential elections, there was a lot of talk about Jews moving to the Republican Party, and in this case, supporting Trump. The Jewish vote is still solidly Democratic, but depending on the poll, it shifted slightly from the high point during the Clinton and Obama years. I'm just wondering what accounts for this shift, and especially when you are out in the field, what do you think accounts for the perception and the reality that American Jews are really voted mostly against the president?
I think when we're talking about the Jewish vote, it's important to acknowledge that most Jews in America are not voting on quote-unquote Jewish issues. Gun control, the economy, abortion, all of the other issues that people care about, and we see this in polling of the Jewish community, and both from within the Jewish world and polling that comes from the most reputable sources. And I think that is one of the reasons why we see the Jewish vote stick solidly in the Democratic camp. I do think that there were some shifts, even if small, and I think what's important to talk about is there was this feeling in the Jewish community, and it's something that I heard a lot, and maybe it's more anecdotal, and so perhaps that makes it a little bit difficult to quantify, but I would hear from people last year, Jews who are solid, true blue, lifelong Democrats who didn't vote for Trump, would never vote for Trump, but did see Kamala Harris and had some concerns about the way that she spoke about pro-Palestinian protesters and language that she used that was maybe more sympathetic. And so I think that the shift toward Trump, toward Republicans among Jewish Americans was relatively small, but there were some concerns that came up. And then there were people who definitely did shift, people who I had talked to who in 2020 didn't vote for Trump that year, said, I will never vote for him again. And then last year had this perception that maybe he was better for Israel. And we'll talk more about the policy of that and whether that was true. And that's something that he also presents. I mean, for anyone here who watched the Trump-Netanyahu meeting in the Oval Office yesterday, Trump said that on multiple occasions, that I am the best friend Israel has ever had. And now we can all recite that word verbatim because he said it so many times. And once you hear something like that, it kind of sticks in people's heads. And there certainly is truth to him being a pro-Israel president, but it's much more complicated, and we'll come back to the policy.
So I know that we're such a small minority of Americans. It's very difficult, actually, to get good polling on Jewish attitudes about politics or anything. And there's a subset of Jews that's even smaller. But we definitely have seen a divide in many respects between Orthodox and Haredi communities and everyone else. And I'm just wondering, in your reporting, did you see evidence of that? And if so, what were the reasons?
I think the reasons also go back to this idea that Jews are not only voting on Jewish issues, and maybe I think it's fair to say that Orthodox Jews do consider those issues more, but those communities often tend to be more politically conservative as well and have more right-wing social values. So I think that also factors into where those allegiances lie and where those votes come down. But absolutely, it's something I've seen, and I think as the Orthodox community continues to grow and be a larger subset of the American Jewish community, that will affect the political trends as well. And the 66 to 70 whatever percent number of Jews who voted for Democrats in that range that we've seen for many years, as there continue to be more Orthodox Jews in America, that number does not apply within the Orthodox community, and that's a trend certainly I'm keeping an eye on.
Thanks. So now, Eli, I'd like to get your take on this. You work for the Free Press, which takes a far more skeptical view of conventional wisdom from the left. I think it's fair to say. So from your perspective, how has Trump affected the Jewish vote in the recent elections? And do you think is he posed to keep that? Is this going to last?
Well, if you're thinking about the 2024 election, let's talk about the elephant in the room. The Democratic Party ran somebody who I think was demonstrably unfit for office for a second term, and then when he showed how unfit he was for the office, undercut their own party's primary and nominated the vice president, who I don't think was clearly ready. And I think that alone is something that's going to affect every group. So there was a kind of self-discrediting that happened for the Democrats because of the Biden experience, because he stayed on too long, because he misinterpreted the 2022 midterms. Anyway, whatever it was, we're now starting to read the first books about it. So right off the bat, Trump is poised to gain in all groups, including Jewish groups. Add to that, October 7th. Biden is very strong after October 7th. Everybody kind of heard he might be the less Democratic president who feels it in his kishkas. And yet, the internal dynamics of the Democratic Party meant not necessarily that you were going to get somebody who was more in sympathy with Gaza than Israel, but it meant that it was a constituency that was important enough to the party that they couldn't just simply be ignored. And so you're going to have to be in a coalition with people who were on the side of Hamas, effectively, or were on the side of the Palestinians, or were basically had taken this kind of anti-Zionist line. I think that is a bridge too far even for many liberal Jews. Doesn't mean that the Democratic candidate or the party itself would take that position, but it was part of the coalition. And as evidence of that, the obvious political choice to be Kamala Harris's vice president was Josh Shapiro, who was a popular governor in the key swing state of Pennsylvania. And for whatever reason, he didn't get it, and they gave it to, I guess I'll editorialize a kind of laughably. Anyway, I'm very unimpressed with Governor Walz. Maybe some people in this audience would disagree, but that seemed to me like, well, why is it that Josh Shapiro didn't get the nod? It seems like it's so obvious. Maybe it was interpersonal, who knows? But I think it was partly because they didn't want to offend these voters that were kind of this anti-Israel faction of the Democratic Party, and that's something that I think that's really uncomfortable. So that's a dynamic. the end of the day, if it's 71% of, I mean, that's still 71% of the Jews who voted in the election, still Democrat, then, I mean, I don't know. I don't know that it made much of a difference, but I do think that that is the kind of thing that caused some of the reservations. It's a little bit more subtle than just say, as like Trump would say, Democrats hate Israel. That's not true. But it's the fact that their coalition includes this group. Now, you asked going forward what it means. Well, is he poised to do that? Well, part of the MAGA coalition is Tucker Carlson and the New Nationalists. And, through the miracle of horseshoe theory, they kind of end up on the same square as the college Tentifada crowd. So I don't know. Like I throw up my hands in some ways. I think there's kind of risks within the coalitions of both parties at this point.
I agree with Eli. I mean, I think, and I don't think it was. I was actually in Pennsylvania, in the greater Philadelphia area, right before her selection of the vice president. I was doing a profile of Josh Shapiro. I was at Josh Shapiro's synagogue. It's a beautiful place. It's designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. You had to see it sometime. And I don't think that it was that she was skittish about alienating Palestinian or Arab American voters. She was skittish about alienating young people who, she saw these protests on the campuses. She was petrified by the loss of the young people. She lost them anyway. But I do think that Trump is kind of like, take him or leave him. You know what you're going to get. Democrats are still beholden to this patchwork coalition of workers and lefty students and environmentalists, whereas Trump just doesn't have as difficult a time assembling a coalition. And I agree with you. I think that Shapiro was the obvious choice, and she just got scared.
So I don't want to talk too much about Shapiro, who, I'm from Philadelphia. My kids went to the same day school as he did. I knew his parents and
I went to the same day school as Shapiro. He was like a class below me. Yeah.
You went to Akiba?
I went to Akiba, yeah.
Oh my God. Well, we'll talk.
Yeah.
I even did penance and served on the board for a few years. That was hard. But I recall also people being very nervous in the Jewish community because not only was he this very proud and openly observant Jew, but if you had Doug Emhoff, Josh Shapiro, and his wife, 3 of the 4 top people in the ticket would be Jews.
I wrote an entire story that was ready to run if she chose Shapiro on that fear in the Jewish community of having such a prominent Jewish politician at the top of the ticket at that particular moment. That was real. There would have been real pride, but there was also real fear, and there was also Michigan.
Yes.
So
yeah. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about media. It does seem that Jews are overrepresented in national and local media. So I just wonder about your assessment of media coverage. Margaret Sullivan, in her column yesterday, she's a well-respected media critic, and she felt that many members of the media are really downplaying what Trump has done and not being as forthright as they should. And if you will, I even can, just to refresh your memory in case you didn't get to read it, she felt that, for example, the protests on Saturday did not get the coverage and the display that they deserved. There were 100,000 demonstrators, and as she said, much of the media reaction was something between a yawn and a shrug, or in some outlets, a sneer. Do you think that's fair?
There was a very different media approach the first time around with Trump. which was self-discrediting in a lot of ways. I think you had mainstream media fall for a kind of now discredited story on the Russia ties. It dominated the coverage for 2.5 years. It was a non-story, a fake story generated by opposition research for Hillary Clinton. You had freakouts every single day. You had newsrooms changing whether or not they had to say, said in a statement, but does not correspond to the facts or whatever. They had to create a whole new kind of style for Trump. The media felt that it was the front lines saving the republic, and it totally failed. And I think it lost a lot of trust. So, I take her point. I have my many criticisms right now with what Trump is doing, but I don't think that it would make sense to get back into the resistance mode that the media had in his first term.
Can I raise something on the Jewish angle, if you will? Something that I have been observing specifically on coverage of anti-Semitism related news from the White House, and I know that we'll talk a lot more about the specifics of this, but in coverage of the way that Trump is handling universities, Columbia, Harvard, et cetera, the threats of pulling funding and the demands that he has for those universities, a lot of the coverage that I see is presenting this as its own thing and not really putting it in the context of the challenges at those schools. And there's a very legitimate question to be asked about, is what Trump's doing actually going to help stop anti-Semitism at those places? But for media outlets and reporters to write about his approach to universities and not also describe the very real problems that a lot of Jewish students are facing at those places, I think also misses the mark. And then for some people in the Jewish world who already feel that the media is out to get them or is biased against the community's concerns, I think that kind of underscores that fear, because regardless of what Trump is doing, there are Jewish students at a lot of campuses in America who have real concerns that should be heard, and whether what's happening now is the way to deal with them or not, those problems exist.
I just want to say, and pardon my language here, but I know Margaret. She used to be the ombudsman at the New York Times, and I just, we are working our asses off. Donald Trump is always keeping us extremely busy. I can't imagine the New York Times doing less coverage or more coverage or whatever. I just think she's being ridiculous. There's this weird notion out there that if outlets like the New York Times or the Washington Post would just be harder on Donald Trump, it would change something. It's absurd. Anybody who's reading the New York Times or the Washington Post probably doesn't like Donald Trump. There's a misunderstanding of the media ecosystem out there. We are becoming less and less and less important. I saw the other day that Piers Morgan has a YouTube channel that gets orders of magnitude more viewers than anything the New York Times ever did. I couldn't believe it because I didn't know Piers Morgan even had a YouTube channel. We are not the media world is completely different than it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and yet there are still people out there who think somehow we are influential. We are not.
Well, I want to say that you are.
I wish.
Not only do I read the New York Times in print from cover to cover every day, but we wouldn't all be here if we didn't think that we had something to offer. But I take your point. Gabby, you brought up anti-Semitism, so I'd like to focus on that for a moment. And in particular, on this whole question of the Trump administration's efforts to frame their actions against universities as an effort to protect students. So 2 pieces caught my eye recently, and I'd just like to bring them up. The first, I'm sure you read Yair Rosenberg's piece last week about anti-Semitism for The Atlantic. And he wrote, in reality, Donald Trump and his allies have been using anti-Semitism as a pretext to advance a radical agenda that has nothing to do with Jews at all and that most American Jews do not support, unquote. And then yesterday, Michael Roth, president of Wesleyan University, full disclosure, I'm an alum, I'm married to one, I'm the parent of 2 other alums, I'm a former trustee, I'm an active volunteer, et cetera. So I'm not entirely an unbiased source here. But this piece in the New York Times said, and again I'll quote, "As the first Jewish president of a formerly Methodist university, I find no comfort in the Trump administration's embrace of my people on college campuses or elsewhere. Jew hatred is real, but today's anti-Semitism isn't a legitimate effort to fight it. It's a cover for a wide range of agendas that have nothing to do with the welfare of Jewish people," unquote. I'm wondering how you all react to that. Who wants to go
Well,
first?
my wife actually is a director at the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, and I know her institute was actually stormed and taken over by Palestinian protesters last year. I think that we have to acknowledge that the rise of left-wing anti-Semitism on college campuses is real. It is happening. I can't even remember who said it, though, but fairly recently somebody said Donald Trump hates left-wing anti-Semitism not because it's anti-Semitism, but because it's left-wing. So I think that we also have to be clear-eyed about these things. I mean, when you see Donald Trump, going after law firms and saying they, forcing them to do pro bono work on anti-Semitism, this, for me, I wrote an entire book trying to say, look, the anti-Semitism and the rise of bigotry is real. We should be paying attention to it. That was 2018. Now we're in 2025, and I'm saying, wow, we've gone a little too far here. I think that this issue of the politicization of anti-Semitism is very real, and it's somewhat scary because I think that Jews are once more caught in the middle of this left-right tangle, and it's a very uncomfortable place to be.
On the point that you made about Trump caring about anti-Semitism because it's a left-wing problem, that I think is absolutely correct, and we see first from people I've spoken with who are close to the president, who are involved with that work, kind of fighting anti-Semitism from conservative spaces, not within conservative spaces, but the conservatives who are working on the issue. Many of them view it entirely as a left-wing phenomenon, and something that I observe in paying attention to press releases and statements and press briefings from this White House, whether it's Carolyn Leavitt at the podium in the White House or the Education Department or the Justice Department, when we see the Trump administration talk about anti-Semitism, it is often, almost always next to getting trans women out of women's sports, or getting men out of women's sports, as they say, and also ending DEI programs. And those three are often grouped together, which I think is indicative of the way that they think about it. That being said, when looking at what's happening on campuses and the way that the Trump administration is approaching it, I think it's imperative to break down the actions into their individual pieces. So you have the deportations, you have the funding cuts. I've talked to students at some of these universities who feel very uncomfortable that the funds that Trump is threatening to pull are things like cancer research and really important programs. We can all obviously agree on that. But at least in the case of Columbia, which gave in to some of Trump's demands, you have students saying, these are things that I tried to talk to the administration about at Columbia a year ago, and they haven't listened to me. And that's a really complicated thing to grapple with, that the reason they're doing it now is giving in to threats from the federal government. And it puts Jewish students in this uncomfortable position of being kind of on the front lines of, we want these changes, we don't like Trump, what do we do about it? And it's the same for the deportations, where you have a lot of these students who see Trump going after people who they find in a lot of cases deplorable, but think, wait a second, like, I don't support his immigration agenda, which is what Yair wrote about in that piece last week. And I don't know that we've seen evidence, and this is certainly something I'll be watching for, of whether any of this actually makes Jewish students at these campuses safer? That's the important question, and we just don't know.
Well, I hope what I'm about to say will disappoint all sides on the issue. So I have zero problems putting, having the federal government put conditions on money that goes to universities. Plenty of other administrations have done this when it comes to political issues. You had an entire agenda from the education department to change the due process considerations in the case of sexual assault on campus, and those affected federal monies. I don't really have a problem with it if it comes to changing what was a totally unfair application of DEI standards on these campuses. And we can't get around the fact that every other minority on campus, if they said, I feel unsafe because of a speaker or an op-ed or whatever, everybody would jump and make sure it never happened again. But when Jews were like, hey, I have a problem with a bunch of people demonstrating in solidarity with Hamas, it became a free speech issue. I'm a free speech person. I actually don't think that campuses should be primarily safe. I think you should be made to feel uncomfortable. And I would like to just get rid of all the DEI and have everybody be offended, because that's life in the big city. But if you're going to have the rules that every other group gets special protections except for the Jews, then I think that we have an obligation as a community to say, sorry, that doesn't work for us. So that's point one. Point two, I cannot stress to you how heartbreaking it is for me to tell you that Donald Trump's utter disregard for the First Amendment and free speech, which I cherish, has put me in the position of having to defend Mahmoud Khalil. And what I mean by that is, unless this administration, when it comes to deporting students on a green card, or deporting people with a student visa, or this woman Ozturk who goes to Tufts, if it's simply for a speech crime, if it is simply for a thought crime, if it is because they expressed an opinion that I certainly find loathsome, and I'm sure the White House finds loathsome, that is un-American if that is the grounds to deport such a person. So I disappointed a lot of my friends on the right when I wrote about this for the Free Press, but I am just absolutely, I'd say it's just maddening, because I generally support, I think that the universities need to be shaken up at this point, but to assert the right of the Secretary of State to deport a former graduate student for willy-nilly reasons based on a McCarthy-era law without due process, that's a road I don't think anyone should want to go down to. I say that on American grounds, and I think American Jews ought to be particularly sensitive to those issues from a kind of just purely civil libertarian perspective.
So I'm just following up on that. I'm wondering what you think about the cascade of statements coming from the ADL when it came to the Khalil situation. I think that at first, if I recall correctly, Jonathan Greenblatt basically supported what Trump did, and then shortly afterwards kind of, I don't want to say backtracked, but certainly took a position that seemed less supportive of Trump's administration's behavior and expressing more concern about the lack of due process.
I like the latest Greenblatt. I think that we have to be really clear, and this is not necessarily a Jewish issue.
Well, which latest?
Saying he's been critical. He has come out and he's been critical.
Right, but that was like a few days.
Right, so I'm saying I like where it's evolved too, but like it's not necessarily a Jewish issue, but like the administration's admitting they sent somebody to an El Salvadorian hellhole prison, which our own State Department has said doesn't meet basic human rights standards, and then they sent the wrong guy. That's why there's due process, because it bothers me that an administration is operating with the idea that due process is a privilege for the guilty. No, it's a protection for the innocent. And so, I really don't have a problem in theory of deporting Mahmoud Khalil or any number of people if they were engaged in an actual crime. But if you are not going to present that evidence and just assert, well, he did a bunch of bad stuff, I think, I can't have it. It's un-American. And I think that should be a bigger emergency for the Jewish community because we care about this principle, and I don't want you to fight anti-Semitism while trouncing on, free speech in the First Amendment.
I can't tell you how disappointed I am in Jonathan Greenblatt and the Anti-Defamation League. I mean, Eli's right. The last statement that he made emphasized due process, but when I say emphasize, I say with a small e. I mean, when Elon Musk threw up a stiff-armed salute and his statement, Jonathan Greenblatt's statement, was, "We're not sure what that was." I mean, I could feel it. I could feel the capture of the moneyed class with the Anti-Defamation League, which is a horrifying thing to say and a horrible thing to say. But I've been in that position. I remember when my book Semitism came out in 2018. It was perceived by some very, very rich people in Atlanta as anti-Trump, and I was barred from the Jewish Book Festival in my hometown. And there is a capture going on of kind of the moneyed conservative Jewish class that really it frightens me. And the Anti-Defamation League, which was founded after the lynching of Leo Frank, to be this deferential, to be this quiet, it's just shocking to me.
You don't think a similar dynamic goes on with the left moneyed class?
Oh, absolutely. Okay. The Democratic Party? Absolutely.
I'm just saying, I think it goes both ways.
Yes, no, that is the function of our society at this moment.
It was interesting that actually even Abe Foxman distanced himself from that.
Yeah, the notion that when Jonathan Greenblatt took over the ADL, Abe Foxman felt like something of a fossil, and it was, there's a breath of fresh air, and suddenly Abe Foxman is now having to voice a louder opinion than Jonathan Greenblatt. It's shocking to me.
What do you hear in terms of reactions in the Jewish community, Gabby?
Well, I want to add on the Greenblatt point, and I'm not going to weigh in, but I, as a journalist who interviewed him about this last week, it wasn't a few days, by the way, after the Khalil deportation that he changed his opinion. It was a matter of weeks, and what it took, from what he told me, was that was the arrest of this graduate student from Turkey at Tufts, which I'm sure all of you have been following in your backyard. And I think what we're seeing within the Jewish community is, until now, there has been something of a wait-and-see approach. And after the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil, the ADL, one of the reasons that their statement stood out, and the statement in which Jonathan Greenblatt said, "We hope this is a deterrent to other people," and that there was praise for the step that Trump was taking. So it wasn't especially equivocal. And now what Jonathan Greenblatt is saying is, again, weighing in on these due process questions, but it was this case of the Tufts student where the only thing that truly any of us reporters, internet sleuths, anyone out there, as far as I can tell, has been able to find about this woman is that she wrote an op-ed in the Tufts student newspaper calling for divestment from Israel. Yes, exactly. And that is, in theory, the reason for her losing her student visa and being deported. And I reached out to the Department of Homeland Security, and what they said was she had done things in support of Hamas. And so the question is there something they're not telling us, or is simply calling for divestment from Israel the same thing in the eyes of this administration as supporting Hamas? And I view that as a huge distinction and two very different things, even if personally divesting from Israel is not something that I agree with. And I think as this goes on and we start to see those limits tested of who is being arrested, what's being demanded of universities, I think we'll see more from the Jewish community, but certainly there is still, I think, some hesitation to weigh in.
Yeah, if I can just add here, I think that universities last year had an obligation to not just their Jewish students, to all the students, to end the tent encampments, to make sure that students who were engaged in very loud and disruptive demonstrations at like Israeli history classes, we saw things like that, that were beyond, that was not a free speech. When you get into property destruction, things like that, there should have been harsh penalties. There was a failure of the universities not to do something about that. But we should make it really clear. Jewish students do not need to be protected from pro-BDS op-eds. That is absurd. We are too resilient. We have endured so much. Please read Menachem Begin's memoir of life in the Gulag, White Nights. We've lived through worse. So my view is just like, I do not want to have the next generation of American Jews kind of be these snowflakes who are these, fragile and so delicate that they can't even imagine coming across a professor who might challenge their entire, belief in Zionism or something like that. So I just think that we have to distinguish between what kinds of speech and what we expect of these administrations versus go write all the op-eds you want.
Okay, so now I think it's time for us to go to Israel and Gaza. Prime Minister Netanyahu was at the White House yesterday. He met with President Trump. It seems that he did not get relief from tariffs or backing for military action against Iran, which were supposedly his main objectives, but he did get a green light to continue the war in Gaza. So here's what I want to ask, and this is not a political statement, this is just truly, I am curious. That last objective, to continue the war in Gaza, is at odds with the majority of the Israeli public. The most recent poll, just short time ago, from the Israel Democracy Institute, which I think we can all say is a fairly well-respected and centrist group, showed that 72.5% of Jewish Israelis believe that Netanyahu should take responsibility for the events of October 7th, 2023, and that he should resign from his position either immediately or after the war ends. That sentiment was shared by even more Israeli Arabs, 78.5%. Only 10% of Jewish Israelis believe he should neither take responsibility or resign. So here you have a vast majority of Israelis feeling that way about the prime minister, and yet I don't see the Jewish establishment reflecting that position at all. So am I missing something, Gabby?
I think you are missing something. I mean, Chuck Schumer said that he should resign. I mean, I think the Jewish establishment is being pretty tough on
I'm talking
Netanyahu.
about the establishment of Jewish organizations, not Jewish politicians, albeit in high positions.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I don't think that's something we've seen from Jewish organizations on any Israeli prime minister. I mean, I think it's an interesting question about should they be calling for Bibi to resign if that's what Israeli Jews want, or Israelis, period. I don't expect that to happen, just given the role that they play in trying to be a bridge between American Jews and Israel. I think the question is looking at, and this is the kind of boring work of being a journalist, like reading statements and looking for small little changes of where they might be shifting to respond to these things. And at least for me, the question that's more interesting than how they treat Bibi is how they're treating Trump. And for example, after the Oval Office meeting yesterday, and I'm gonna, I guess, ask a question that I don't know the answer to because when traveling here today, I didn't have time to catch up to all of the reaction from that meeting that they had. There were a number of things that Trump said that I would imagine would be very surprising to a lot of people in the quote-unquote Jewish establishment. He said, not only is he not going to change the tariffs on Israel, when that was brought up in a question from a reporter, he said, well, we give Israel $4 billion a year in military aid, and maybe suggested the tariff is now something that Israel owes because of that, and sort of tying these things together in a way that I think a lot of, certainly the Israelis, and I have heard this and read this, are uncomfortable with. And he also talked about having direct talks with Iran, which is something that many of the more center-right Jewish groups, certainly AIPAC, for example, have been opposed to for many years. And so the question is, are they going to stand up and say, for what those principles are, and say, we don't agree with this? I mean, we saw Bibi in some ways cave to Trump, and when it seems like from all reports he was kind of blindsided by Trump when he got to the Oval Office yesterday. He thought he was flying to Washington to talk about tariffs, and then he got there and Steve Witkoff, Trump's top negotiator, said to Bibi, actually, we're here to let you know that we're about to negotiate with the Iranians, which is something that Bibi has avoided he's been against that his whole career. So when Trump does things that go outside of the norm of even what Bibi, this very right-wing Israeli prime minister, wants, what kind of response are we going to see? And I think from a lot of corners, certainly from Netanyahu, it's not outright argument or condemnation. It's trying to go along with it and see if they can change his mind.
I guess, Eli, I want you to, of course, respond, but I just want to follow up to say that certainly in my time in Jewish media, Jewish organizations, the main ones, the well-funded ones, I'm not talking about J Street, had the attitude that if American Jews criticized the Israeli government, then that was being disloyal to Jews and to Israel. And it's interesting to me to see the silence when Israelis so adamantly criticize their government.
He's still the elected leader of Israel. And yeah, there's opinion poll that says all kinds of things. You can ask the question a certain way. If you said, do you support the aims of the war to get the hostages back and destroy Hamas? Most Israelis would agree with that. I don't quite understand the question. I don't think it would work if the formal Jewish American organizations, decided they were going to criticize the elected prime minister of Israel because he was at that moment unpopular. Israel has its own system. When there are elections and the next Israeli elected prime minister, Jewish American organizations will, support them. But I don't think, I kind of agree with the traditional stance. It's our safe haven. We don't pay taxes. We don't serve in the IDF if we choose not to. We're not taking the risk. So I do think that from just a communal organization, not as journalists, absolutely criticize the Israeli government, criticize every government. But I'm saying if I was running like federations or, AIPAC or something like that, I would take the same view. He's the elected leader. We'll move on to the next one. That's for the Israelis to decide.
I also will add something that is often left out of the conversation that we're having now after October 7th, which is that in the several months leading up to October 7th, when there were these judicial reform protests happening across Israel every Saturday night, getting hundreds of thousands of people in the street, we did actually see more criticism of that process, of what was happening in the government and within Israel's democracy from Jewish organizations, from rabbis in America who normally would never weigh in on that kind of thing. And I don't think that often they were doing so under the heading of Netanyahu has to go. But there are ways that we have seen criticism, but I don't think that saying Netanyahu should be out of office is, like Eli said, it's not something that we're going to see from those organizations.
Also, let's talk about what the Jewish establishment is. I'm sorry. I understand that Jewish organizations like your dad's, that these organizations have a voice, and an incredible infrastructure, but I think that one of the most significant and perhaps perilous outgrowths of the Gaza war, and in some ways the rise of Trump, is Israel as a partisan issue, and the democratic establishment, especially the Jewish democratic establishment, moving away from the Israeli government. It's not just Chuck Schumer. If you just look down the list of Jewish senators who are now routinely voting to withhold arms from Israel or criticizing the government of Israel constantly. This is a generational breach that the American and Israeli governments are going to have to be dealing with this for years and years and years to come.
Or for every Schumer, there is a Fetterman.
Who's
and
not
he's
Jewish.
not Jewish.
Exactly, but I'm just saying, yes, things are shifting right now. Is it surprising that there's like liberal Jewish Democrats who are shifting away from Israel? I'm not that surprised, given kind of where the left is. But there are like lots of like all new kinds of supporters of Israel who are terrific. So I always look at it like you lose some and you gain some.
Okay, many more things that I wish to say about that, but we're going to move on and take a few questions. Thank you. So someone raises the point about Trump's relationship and commitments to evangelical Christians here in this country. Particularly, you see the nomination of Mike Huckabee to be the next ambassador to Israel. And what is your sense of how his Israel policy may be shaped by that constituency as much as by Orthodox Jews? I have to just say one thing from my experience. When I was at the Forward, I remember when Trump signed the executive order to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And in the official photo that was released by the White House, there's a president at the desk signing the order, and there's only one person behind him. There were no Jews, no Jewish leaders, not even his Jewish son-in-law and grandchildren. The only person behind him in the picture was Vice President Pence, Mike Pence, an evangelical. And there was, because this was December, a Christmas tree. And I just wonder if that is in any way telling for where the true constituency for him politically, because there are many, many more evangelicals than Jews, and almost the percentage of evangelicals who voted for Trump is even higher than the percentage of Jews who voted for Kamala Harris.
You're jogging a memory here, because you asked me right at the beginning how Donald Trump talked to Jews or talked about Israel. And I was talking about the general election, but now I'm thinking back as somebody who has spent way, way, way too much time at social conservative, Christian conservative rallies in Iowa. That's where Donald Trump talked about Israel all the time. And it was a reliable applause line. I mean, there's no question. Look, there are a lot more evangelical voters in the Republican Party than Jewish voters in the Republican Party. There are a lot more evangelical voters in the United States than Jewish voters in the United States.
Yeah.
Donald Trump knows where his bread is buttered, and Israel is a big, big deal among evangelical voters. No question about it. It was an absolute. I mean, every Republican running in the Iowa caucuses would also talk about their steadfast support for Israel. But there was something about the way Trump talked about it. He had already put his money where his mouth was, and people just believe him.
So could you just say a little bit more about what language did he use? What policies did he promote?
I mean, the thing about Trump is that he doesn't speak evangelical. He can't actually quote scripture or do anything really in depth to appeal to evangelicals. But in 2020, in the 2024, 2023, 2024 timeframe, he could look back and he could say, I moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The Golan Heights, there is a sign at the top of the Golan Heights that says Trump Heights. He could show them that he did what he promised he would do, and nobody else had done it, and it was undeniable, and it worked.
Eli, did you want to say something?
I mean, just is that a problem that evangelicals like Israel? I mean, the thing is, it's great. Like, I don't agree with their eschatology, We don't, you know what I mean? I don't share a view of the end times. I mean, okay. But, we agree on Israel. That's fantastic, right?
Well, I'll add on Mike Huckabee. The thing that's interesting about him is not just that he's not Jewish, and for a very long time, Jews were basically not allowed to be the ambassador to Israel. That has obviously changed in the past couple of decades. So in that sense, it is actually notable that we have a Christian ambassador now to Israel, but he's taken positions on annexation in the West Bank that are outside the norm of, broadly speaking, the liberal Jewish community. And that's where I think some of those complications come into play. Broadly speaking, the evangelical community is pro-Israel, but it's not always the same way as a lot of people in the Jewish world.
I think that to answer your question, what's wrong with it? I'm not going to say there's something wrong with it, but when evangelicals talk about Israel and Israeli politics, there is a messianic tone to it, and there's an anti-democratic tone to it. They talk about King David as their avatar for what we should be aiming at. They talk about. I remember going.
I like King David.
I remember going to a rally where they were saying someday we will not need elections.
All right. Okay. So I know where we're going here. Let me just say this. I do not share a particular view with a lot of evangelicals of the end times. I don't. Truth be told, I'm not an atheist, but I'm a believer in a very broad sense. But okay, fine. I'm very secular. But politics is about building coalitions. And if people get to the same position as where I'm at in a different way, that's fine. People are all kinds of reasons why people are environmentalists. There are all kinds of reasons why people support labor unions. Why can't there be a broad-based coalition of Americans who get to the pro-Israel position, especially at a time when we're losing our own? You just said it. We're losing all these Democrats.
Absolutely.
So I think it's wonderful that these evangelicals like Israel. God bless.
And I'm certainly not suggesting that the Republican Party or Donald Trump reject their love for Israel. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that there is a way they talk about Israel that Jews don't talk about Israel, and that is absolutely true.
Okay, on to another question. Are you concerned that if the economy gets really, really bad, not just the stock market, but the economy, that this can be blamed on the Jews in some way?
Always. Happens throughout history. If the economy gets really bad, I'm very freaked out about that, especially since we have the bad side of the right, which is the Candace Owenses of people like that, already planting the crazy seeds. So absolutely, that freaks me out.
Can you explain a little bit more what you
Candace
mean about
Owens is I don't know, what is she? She's an influencer who has millions of followers, who at one point was part of the Daily Wire, which is run by Ben Shapiro, who obviously very pro-Israel. They had a falling out, and she has gone down conspiracy lane, and every day it's a new anti-Jewish conspiracy theory. She, for example, the founding of the ADL is because of the lynching of Leo Frank. She has dredged that case up and said, no, he was really guilty, and blames it. There are racial components. She's talked about how Israel's a haven for pedophiles. I don't even want to dignify it because a lot of it is nuts. We recently had a whole thing about who really shot JFK, which has always been, but there's a prominent people on the kind of fringy right online that are saying Israel had something to do with it, which is, if you're like me and you've kind of dived into this topic, is totally crazy, but okay. But this is out there. And so I don't think it's a threat right now, but if the economy really dips and people are looking for scapegoats, that is something that absolutely terrifies me.
I'm waiting for the resurgence of the alt-right too. I mean, it's not just Candace Owen. There is this new idea that Epstein was a Mossad agent who, and the reason that we haven't seen...
You're talking about Jeffrey Epstein.
Jeffrey Epstein was a Mossad agent working for the Israelis. The reason that we have not seen the Epstein files is because the Israelis are holding this sword over Trump's head. It's in the ferment. It's going to come back. There's no question.
I think it'll come back in the sense that it'll keep rising, but I think it's already here when you see Tucker Carlson and Joe Rogan platforming these horrendous Holocaust deniers. And I want to pivot off of what Eli said about Leo Frank and make a Leo Frank connection, which is sort of a strange thing to do in 2025, if you're not talking about parade maybe, but some of you probably have seen the story that maybe a month ago, everything blends together, even though, as Jane said, it's only been 90 days. The Trump administration appointed as the deputy spokesperson at the Pentagon, so...
The State Department, I think.
No, the Pentagon,
Oh, no,
the Defense Department.
Right.
A young woman who has just a crazy online social media presence who is spreading this propaganda that Leo Frank, who is the only Jew who was lynched in all of American history because he was falsely accused of murdering a young white woman. This woman, who is now in the number 2 spokesperson role at the Pentagon, is sharing on her Twitter account that he's actually guilty of it, which is the falsehood that the Ku Klux Klan supported. That's what they're really famous for. The KKK is saying that. And she said many other crazy things as well. It was reported all over the place, and nothing happened. She's in her job.
And I think it's the State Department's, I don't know his position, director of outreach or something like that, who's also, he hasn't been as outspoken, but he's been retweeting, I guess we don't call him retweeting, any re-Xing, these kind of alt-right figures too. And I just, that is something that I really, I wrote about in 2018, and it's still the case that very senior people around Donald Trump have, if not coddled members of the alt-right, certainly haven't shunned them. I mean, this, Kanye West and Nick Fuentes were at dinner with Donald Trump not that long ago. So there is a reluctance to repudiate anyone who supports Donald Trump, and many of those people are anti-Semitic.
I agree with you. You shouldn't be meeting with Nick Fuentes, and it's very sad as a hip hop fan to see Kanye go down this path. I
would not have thought that you were a hip hop fan.
Absolutely, and you can check I've written about Kanye, and it's hard anyway. But there is a distinction. I don't think Trump has hatred of Jews in his heart. I really mean that, and I'm basing it on a lot of the data. He's an egotist. He's a narcissist. There's a lot of things you could say about the man, but I just don't get that I don't think he's a hater of our people.
I wasn't suggesting that.
No, I know you weren't. I just wanted to distinguish.
And this has been a debate that's been going on for so long. Is Donald Trump an anti-Semite or not? And it's kind of a pointless debate at this point. So,
but just to follow up on that, should we be concerned that might not have been in this country, but we had the vice president meeting with leaders of the alt-right in Germany and castigating that government for not including them more? Is that a concern?
Okay. I don't like the AfD in Germany. I have a lot of issues with it. There's an element of the AfD for sure that gets into Nazi iconography and so forth. But there's also a lot of the AfD, and it's not an excuse, that are just saying, wow, these immigration policies we've had under Angela Merkel were crazy. There are even Jews who supported them because they didn't like that. They thought that there were too many extremist Muslims who came in. And my offense with J.D. Vance for the meeting he had with AfD and his entire Munich performance was the disrespect it showed to our European allies and what that means for the broader world order. So I kind of criticize it on those grounds. Again, for me, it's to make that call, this person is anti-Semitic, I just think we have to be very careful with that kind of label. So, I don't want to defend what he did with the AfD, meeting with the AfD, but I don't think it's quite the same thing as the totally agreed shambolic meeting at Mar-a-Lago with Nick Fuentes and Kanye West and all that. Like that was just I don't know why that happened, and it's a different kind of thing.
And on the AFD topic, Elon Musk is also someone who has had a lot of praise for AFD, and Elon Musk obviously being a person who exerts a great amount of influence on the government and in some ways all of our lives, depending on how far it goes. And to spend some time on his profile on X, which I hope that all of you do that much less than those of us up here, because it's never ending. He shared all kinds of things that raise alarm bells, and it's too much to keep up with even. And I'm just going to share one, which, as I'm sure you're all following, lots of federal workers are losing their jobs, and Elon Musk shared something. He didn't write it, but he reshared it to his account, re-X'd it, if you will. A few weeks ago, the sentiment was, I don't remember the exact quote, but Hitler, Stalin, and Mao didn't kill millions of people. Their public servants did, or their federal bureaucrats or something like that, as if suggesting that's where the problem is and not Hitler somehow. And I know we can parse everyone's social media accounts to no end, but he's someone who has such a great deal of influence and clearly is spending time in these very far-right conspiratorial ecosystems.
He did
online.
wear the hostage pin. I think still does. He went to Auschwitz. There's some very good things that Elon Musk has done, like providing the satellite service initially for the Ukrainians after Russia invaded. That tweet's crazy. I agree with you, but
sure. I'm also not litigating if Elon Musk is an anti-Semite in the same way. I don't think it's useful for Donald Trump. But just to say that he's another person who engages with this very out there content, and I think that matters, even if it also does matter that he wears the hostage pin in the same way that it matters that Trump has met with hostages, and we heard him talk about the hostages yesterday who have been released, and it does seem to deeply affect him. And
you got to credit him for that, I think.
And the deal that brought a lot of hostages home, absolutely.
So here's a question that came actually from someone who says that he or she, they, are a non-Jew. Isn't it all possible to be critical of Israel without being accused of anti-Semitism?
Of course.
And so I'd like to take it one step further in a way that would be very helpful for people like yourselves who really think about this so much and deal with words and ideas, which is, how can one be critical of Israel without not being accused? How can one be critical of Israel without expressing anti-Semitism?
I think it's pretty easy. If you apply the same standard for the state of Israel's behavior as you would for any other country, that's fine. Governments should be criticized. If you single out Israel, if you only accept one kind of thin, narrow version of sources of information, if you constantly cite Gaza Ministry of Health statistics when we know that that is basically just Hamas, when you use overloaded language like genocide and ethnic cleansing and so forth, there's a whole series of ways in which you can kind of criticize Israel if you're mono-focused on Israel and you have nothing to say about anything else. But yes, if Israel's a government, it's run by human beings. We are flawed. Yes, you can criticize Israel. You can't create a special standard that only allows you to demonize Israel at the expense of any other country. So that's how I would look at it.
Yeah, I'll add, I think a lot of people don't like what Israel is doing, many Israelis, as Jane shared with that data before. I think if your response to I'm not happy with what's happening in Gaza is to say, Israel shouldn't be a country, Zionism is the world's worst evil, it doesn't add up. There are lots of bad things in the world, and to point to only the one Jewish country and Jewish nationalism is the only thing that you think shouldn't exist, I think that raises questions. But to look at how Israel is conducting the war, should Bibi negotiate another deal? Is it bad that he's firing the Shin Bet chief and all kinds of other senior leaders in Israel? There's all kinds of things that are fair game, but when it gets to that level of, I think Zionism is horrible and should be wiped from the earth, those are questions.
I'm going to say something more controversial than that. I think if you say Zionism is the worst thing on earth and should be wiped out, that's okay too. I mean, the fact is, I had a daughter who spent a summer with Tibetan refugees in northern India, and she came back and said she wanted to start a free Tibet club at her high school or senior year, and she was prohibited from doing that because she would offend Chinese students. And I see no difference in saying free Tibet and free Palestine. I see it's a political speech is not bigoted speech. Political speech can be abhorrent, can be awful, but I don't think that, I think that if you think Zionism is absolutely evil, I don't think that you're necessarily a bigot. You could be, but not necessarily.
Does free Tibet mean no China?
Yes.
Okay.
Free Tibet means
I learned something.
get
does that
the
mean,
Han
no
Chinese out of Tibet.
No,
but the
getting
state
the
of
Han
China.
Chinese out of Tibet is one thing. That's not getting rid of all of China.
Well, you're right. I mean, if you said, if I'm a Tibetan and I said, or if I'm a Tibetan rights person and I said, I want all Han Chinese out of Tibet, or if I say I want all Jews out of the West Bank, I think that is equivalent. But I agree, it's not the same thing as, okay, a Tibetan saying I want all Chinese
Okay, but the
out
mainstream,
of Shanghai.
the mainstream like left anti-Zionist position is that Israel as a state should not exist.
I am saying that is a political position that you might find abhorrent, but I do not think it's bigotry.
The Jews are the only people that don't get their own state. I mean, all right, fine, Kurds too.
Look, I do not agree.
No,
with
I know
that.
you don't. I'm just saying. I mean, listen, I happen to think hate speech is free speech too. So I think you have a right to be bigoted. But if you are going to say that the only state that you think that shouldn't exist happens to be the only Jewish state, I think that is evidence of anti-Semitism.
I mean, it might be, but I mean, look, I spent like a summer in a Palestinian village called Ibilin in northern Israel, in Israel within the 48 boundaries, and Elias Shakur, who was at that time the priest of the village. It wasn't a village; it was actually a sprawling town, but it was deemed a village because that way they didn't have to get they didn't have to bring sewage to it. Elias Shakur believed in the one-state solution. That the Jews would not have control, although they would have some representation in a one state. Elias Shakur was the farthest thing from an anti-Semite. He took a political position. There should be one state.
All right, that's a fair point. You know what? In the interest of conversation, if you are a priest in a small village that doesn't get sewage in northern Israel, and you think there should be one state with Jews and Arabs and everybody getting a single vote, then it's not evidence of anti-Semitism. If you're a literature professor at Columbia University and the only thing you ever want to talk about is why Israel shouldn't exist, and you have nothing to say about the cultural genocide against the Uyghurs or any number of other issues in the world and so forth, you're an anti-Semite. And I don't really care if Columbia doesn't get money or has its grants, conditional upon changing around your department.
And if you're smearing blood on the house of the president of the Brooklyn Museum, you're an anti-Semite.
Yeah, you're an anti-Semite
Yes,
with the
I
red
understand
triangle and so forth.
Okay. Well, it seems that this conversation could go on forever, but we're going to stop it there for now. You have been an absolutely wonderful audience. Thank you so much. But special thanks to Jonathan Weissman and Gabby Deutch and Eli Lake, and to the JCC for sponsoring this hot and cool conversation.